If you leave him now, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. That's what she said. Not my therapist, not my husband, not even someone who lived with us. It was my Aunt Linda, twice divorced, telling me I should stay married until my daughter finished college, even if I was unhappy, even if I felt empty, even if I disappeared a little more every year. I remember staring at her, trying to understand how someone who didn't wake up in my bed, didn't share my home, didn't carry my fears, felt so sure about my future. And yet, I listened. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. It echoed in my head for weeks, quietly rearranging my doubts, my guilt, my sense of responsibility. Not because it was wise, but because it sounded confident. At the time, I didn't see the danger in that. I thought advice was care. I thought opinions were support. I thought talking meant I was doing something right. I had no idea that moment was the beginning of something much bigger than a bad conversation, because once I let one voice in, others followed. And soon, my marriage no longer belonged just to the two people living inside it. It belonged to everyone else. It happened slowly. So slowly I didn't notice the shift until it was already complete. I never sat down and decided to expose my relationship. I didn't announce my doubts or ask for permission to be unhappy. I was just tired, confused, carrying questions I didn't know how to answer alone. So I talked. At first, it felt harmless, necessary even. A release. I shared pieces of my frustration with people I trusted, friends, family, co-workers, people who asked how I was doing and seemed genuinely concerned. And when they listened, when they reacted, when they took my side, something inside me relaxed. Finally, someone understood. What I didn't realize was that understanding came with interpretation, and interpretation came with judgment, and judgment came with direction. Everyone had something to say about my marriage, what I should tolerate, what I shouldn't forgive, what a strong woman would do. What kind of example I was setting. No one asked what it felt like to live inside that relationship day after day. No one asked what I still loved. No one asked what I was afraid of losing. They only reacted to the parts of the story I gave them. And little by little, without meaning to, I started giving them more. I didn't notice when my husband stopped being a person in my stories and became a problem to be analyzed. I didn't notice when our private struggles turned into public material. I didn't notice when I began explaining my marriage more than actually living it. The irony is that I wasn't trying to destroy anything. I was trying to breathe. I believed that talking meant clarity, that sharing meant healing, that advice meant wisdom. I didn't yet understand the difference between support and projection. I didn't yet see that most people weren't responding to my marriage. They were responding to their own, their regrets, their resentment, their unresolved choices, and I absorbed all of it. By the time I realized how loud the noise had become, I could no longer hear myself clearly. My thoughts felt borrowed. My doubts felt rehearsed. My decisions felt like they belonged to an invisible audience. Inside my home, things grew quieter. Outside of it, my marriage was constantly being discussed. That was the moment everything shifted, though I didn't recognize it yet. Because the more I talked, the less I understood what I actually felt. And what started as relief would soon become something else entirely, something heavier, something that would change the way I saw intimacy, loyalty, and the cost of letting too many people live a relationship that was never theirs to begin with. At first, talking saved me. That's the part no one warns you about. When you're drowning emotionally, silence doesn't feel noble. It feels lethal. And the first time I said out loud, "I don't know if I'm happy anymore," it felt like taking my head above water. The relief was instant. Someone listened. Someone nodded. Someone said, "That makes sense." And for a woman who had spent months questioning her own reactions, that validation felt like proof that I wasn't crazy. So I talked again, and again. It wasn't dramatic confessions or explosive truths. It was casual. Coffee conversations, late-night texts, voice notes sent while sitting in my car before going inside the house. I never planned to expose my marriage. I just kept needing air. Every time I shared a small piece, the weight in my chest lifted a little. I told myself it was healthy, that this was what emotionally mature people did. They didn't bottle things up. They processed. They sought perspective. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't processing. I was outsourcing my perception. Each listener became a mirror, and instead of checking if the reflection felt true, I accepted it because it felt comforting. People reacted strongly, stronger than I expected. That's not okay. I'd never put up with that. You deserve better. If it were me, I'd already be gone. Those sentences wrapped around me like certainty. They felt decisive, clean, unlike my own thoughts, which were messy and contradictory. No one asked what I still loved about him. No one asked what we were trying to build. No one asked how I contributed to the distance between us. They didn't mean harm. I know that now. But empathy without responsibility can be dangerous. Because the more they validated my pain, the less room there was for nuance. I stopped sharing moments of connection Not because they didn't exist, but because they complicated the narrative. It was easier to explain my sadness than my ambivalence. Easier to say, we're not good, than to admit, we're struggling, and I'm scared of what that means. Over time, my venting sessions turned into rehearsals. I learned which parts of the story got the strongest reactions, which details made people angrier on my behalf, which phrases earned sympathy instead of silence. Without realizing it, I edited my truth for impact. And the more I talked, the more committed people became to their version of my marriage. They remembered things I barely did. They brought up comments I had made months earlier, long after I had moved on emotionally. Their memory of my pain stayed fresh, even when mine softened. That's when I felt the first subtle shift. I wasn't just being supported, I was being guided. Every conversation ended with direction, advice disguised as care, conclusions I hadn't reached on my own. You know what this means, right? I think deep down you already know the answer. If you stay, don't complain later. Suddenly, my feelings came with expectations attached, and without noticing, I started shaping my emotions to fit what I had already shared. It felt embarrassing to backtrack, weak to say, actually, today felt better, confusing to admit that love doesn't disappear just because things are hard. So I stayed consistent, with them, but inside I grew quieter. What started as relief slowly became pressure, the kind you don't feel until you stop and realize your chest has been tight for days. I felt watched, not physically, but emotionally, like my next move had an audience. I told myself I was just being honest. I didn't yet understand that honesty without boundaries isn't courage, it's exposure. And exposure, when repeated, doesn't always heal. Sometimes it slowly dismantles the very thing you're still trying to understand. It took me a while to notice the pattern. At first, every opinion sounded different. Different words, different tones, different intentions. But emotionally, they all landed in the same place, certainty. Everyone seemed so sure about what I should do, while I felt completely unsure about what I felt. That imbalance alone should have warned me. I began replaying conversations in my head, not for comfort, but for clarity. And that's when I realized something unsettling. Most advice wasn't about my marriage at all. It was about theirs. A friend who had been cheated on told me, with absolute conviction, that men never really change. She said it casually, like a fact of life, like gravity. I nodded, even though my husband had never betrayed me that way. Her pain slipped quietly into my story. Another friend, newly single and proud of it, kept telling me how peaceful life was without having to deal with anyone. She framed independence as salvation, freedom as the only mature choice. What she didn't mention was how lonely she admitted feeling late at night when no one was listening. Even my co-workers had opinions, people who only knew my marriage through passing comments and tired mornings. One of them laughed and said, "Marriage is just a contract anyway." She had been emotionally checked out of her own relationship for years. I absorbed that cynicism like it belonged to me. Each piece of advice came wrapped in personal history, resentment disguised as wisdom, regret disguised as realism, fear disguised as empowerment. No one ever said, "This is my wound talking." They spoke with authority, not awareness, and I didn't question it. I was too vulnerable to separate empathy from projection, too exhausted to filter what applied to me and what didn't. When you're already doubting yourself, borrowed certainty feels like relief. That's how their stories began living inside mine. I started borrowing language that wasn't mine. Phrases I had never used before suddenly rolled off my tongue. Emotional labor, bare minimum. If he wanted to, he would. They sounded sharp, empowered, final. They also made everything smaller. There was no room for complexity, no space for growth, no allowance for seasons, just conclusions. And with every borrowed conclusion, my emotional range narrowed. I stopped checking in with myself. I checked in with what I had already told others, with the version of my marriage they now carried. It felt almost disloyal to feel differently than the story I had shared. That's the danger no one talks about. Once someone invests emotionally in your narrative, they don't want it to change. They want resolution, validation, proof that their advice mattered. So when things felt slightly better at home, I minimized it. When we laughed together, I didn't mention it. Those moments threatened the certainty everyone else had built. Instead, I kept feeding the version of the story that matched their expectations. Without realizing it, I was being shaped. Their bitterness sharpened my perception. Their disappointments lowered my tolerance. Their unfinished grief added weight to my confusion. And slowly, subtly, I became less patient, less generous, less curious. Not because my marriage was beyond repair, but because my mind was full of other people's endings. The most unsettling part wasn't that they influenced me. It was that I trusted them more than I trusted myself. I didn't yet understand that advice is never neutral. It always carries the emotional residue of the life it came from. And I was carrying far too many lives that weren't mine. I don't know exactly when it happened. There was no clear moment, No single conversation I could point to and say, this is when everything changed. It was more like erosion, slow, quiet, almost invisible. One day I realized I no longer spoke about my husband as a person. I spoke about him as a summary. He's emotionally unavailable. He doesn't know how to communicate. He avoids conflict. Those sentences sounded informed, mature, like I had done the work, but they were fragments, stripped of context, cleaned of history, detached from the man who still woke up next to me every morning. I stopped saying his name. Names humanize, labels simplify. When I talked about him, I chose the details that fit the version of the story others already believed. The sighs, the silences, the disappointments. I didn't lie, but I edited, and over time, the edits became the truth I repeated most. What I didn't see was how repetition turns perception into identity. Each time I described him as distant, he felt more distant in my mind. Each time I framed him as the problem, I felt more justified in pulling away. The space between us didn't start in our home. It started in the way I narrated him outside of it. People reacted strongly. He sounds selfish. That's emotional neglect. You're carrying everything alone. They said it with certainty, with concern, with outrage on my behalf. And slowly, I began to see him through their eyes. Not as a complex man with limits and fears and blind spots, but as a role. The one who failed. The one who didn't show up enough. The one responsible for my dissatisfaction. I didn't notice when respect slipped. I joked about his flaws in ways I never would have before. Little comments, eye rolls, sarcastic remarks meant to make others laugh. It felt harmless, relatable, but intimacy doesn't survive ridicule. Each time I reduced him to a punchline, something fragile broke between us. Not dramatically, just enough to create distance. At home, I watched him sense the shift before I could name it. He grew quieter, more cautious, like someone unsure of the ground beneath their feet. I told myself he was withdrawing. I didn't ask if I was pushing. The truth is, once a person becomes a character in your story, you stop listening to them as closely. You already know how their lines are supposed to sound. You anticipate, you interpret, you defend. Real conversations require presence. I was no longer present. I had an audience in my head, an invisible group of people who already had opinions about him, about us, about how things would end. And without meaning to, I began performing for them, even when he was standing right in front of me. That's when I understood something too late. You can't protect a relationship you keep explaining to others, because explanation simplifies, and love lives in complexity. By the time I realized my husband had become a character in a story that wasn't entirely mine anymore, the distance between us had a name, and names are hard to erase. The day I realized my marriage had an audience, I felt embarrassed, not because I had shared too much, but because I had started living differently because of it. I noticed it in small moments, harmless ones at first. I'd catch myself thinking, if I tell this story later, how will it sound? Or choosing words carefully in my own head, as if I were already explaining my feelings to someone else. I wasn't just living my relationship anymore. I was narrating it. Every disagreement came with a second layer, how it would be received, how people would react, whether it confirmed or contradicted the version of the story they already believed. When things went wrong, I felt almost justified. See, they were right. When things went right, I felt uncomfortable. How do I explain this now? That's when I realized how dangerous it is to let too many people into the fragile spaces of a relationship. Because once there's an audience, you stop asking, what do I feel? You start asking, what makes sense to everyone else? I began editing my behavior, not to protect the marriage, but to protect the narrative. I reacted faster, drew lines sooner, withheld softness, because softness would confuse the story I had already told. At the same time, the pressure grew. People checked in regularly. So, how are things now? Have you decided what you're going to do? I don't think I could stay if I were you. Their concern felt genuine, but it came with expectations. They wanted updates, progress, a conclusion. I felt like I owed them an ending. Inside my home, my husband felt the shift even though he didn't know why. I was more guarded, less forgiving, quicker to disengage. I brought tension into conversations that once felt safe. I didn't realize how much energy it takes to maintain a performance, because that's what it becomes, a performance. Subtle, but constant. You start living slightly outside yourself, monitoring your reactions, making sure they align with the story you've shared. And intimacy can't survive that. Intimacy needs privacy. It needs room to be messy, inconsistent, unfinished. It needs the freedom to change without explanation. I had taken that freedom away. Our relationship became stiff, like something being observed too closely. Nothing relaxed, nothing softened. Every moment felt heavy with meaning. That's when I understood the cost of exposure. Not everyone needs access to your doubts. Not every conflict needs witnesses. Not every feeling needs an audience. Some things need containment, and I had broken the container. By the time I noticed, my marriage wasn't just between two people anymore. It was surrounded, and I didn't yet know how to make the noise stop. The irony still hurts when I think about it. I was talking more than ever, just not to the person who needed to hear me most. Outside the house, my voice was clear, confident, structured. I knew exactly how to explain what wasn't working, what felt heavy, what I was tired of carrying. I had the language, I had the examples, I had the support. Inside the house, words collapsed. Simple questions turned into tension. Neutral comments felt loaded. Every attempt at conversation carried the weight of everything that had already been said elsewhere. I wasn't curious anymore. I was defensive. When my husband spoke, I listened with my answers ready, not to understand, but to respond, to protect myself, to stay aligned with the version of the story I had already shared. And he felt it. He began choosing silence over misinterpretation. Short replies over explanations. Distance over conflict. I told myself he was emotionally unavailable. What I didn't see was how unsafe the space had become. Not unsafe in a dramatic way, in a quiet, invisible way. The kind where you don't know what will be repeated, reframed, or remembered later by someone who wasn't there. I brought outside energy into our private moments. Comparisons. Conclusions. Other people's words slipped into our arguments without me realizing it. You always shut down. You never show up emotionally. This is exactly what everyone says about you. I never said the last sentence out loud, but it lived in my tone. Conversations ended faster now, either with frustration or with withdrawal. There was no room to explore, to misunderstand, to try again. Everything felt final, and silence moved in. Not the peaceful silence of comfort, the tense kind. The kind that sits between two people on the couch while the TV plays too loudly. The kind that makes you feel lonelier than being alone. I started spending more time on my phone. He spent more time working late. We passed each other in hallways like careful strangers. I told myself this distance was proof that the marriage was failing, proof that my doubts were valid, proof that all the advice I had received was right. I didn't stop to ask what came first, the distance or the exposure. What hurt the most was how normal it all became. We adapted to the silence. We learned how to coexist without really connecting. And the longer it lasted, the harder it felt to break. Because when you talk to everyone else about your relationship, you begin to lose the language to talk inside it. I didn't know how to start anymore. Every sentence felt either too heavy or too late. And in that quiet, something essential faded. Not all at once, just enough to change everything. At some point, I stopped asking myself simple questions. Am I happy? Am I still in love? Do I want to stay? Not because they didn't matter, but because I no longer trusted the answers. My emotions felt contaminated, mixed with too many voices, too many interpretations, too many borrowed conclusions. Every feeling I had came with a footnote, an echo, someone else's opinion attached to it. If I felt sad, I wondered if it meant I was settling. If I felt calm, I wondered if I was just avoiding change. If I felt connected, I wondered if I was being naive. Nothing stood on its own. I noticed it one night while lying awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, trying to identify what was actually happening inside me. I ran through a checklist of everything I had been told. This isn't enough. You deserve more. Love shouldn't feel this hard. Those sentences floated through my head like facts, not opinions. They drowned out quieter emotions, the kind that don't scream but still matter. Affection, familiarity, safety. I had learned to distrust those feelings. They weren't dramatic enough. They didn't fit the urgency of the advice I had received. I felt split in two. There was the version of me who still felt tenderness when he laughed, who missed him when he traveled, who relaxed in his presence without noticing it. And then there was the version of me who felt guilty for those feelings, because they contradicted the story I had told. I didn't know which one was real. I started measuring my emotions instead of experiencing them, analyzing them, ranking them, asking myself what they meant instead of letting them simply exist. That constant self-monitoring was exhausting. I felt disconnected from my own body, my own intuition. I couldn't tell if the heaviness in my chest was sadness, resentment, fear, or just fatigue. So I looked outside myself again. I replayed advice, compared notes, weighed options based on how they would sound if I explained them later. I tried to imagine which decision would feel more justifiable, not which one felt true. That's when I realized something frightening. I had lost access to my inner voice, not because it was gone, but because I had trained myself not to listen to it. Every time I ignored a quiet truth in favor of loud certainty, that voice grew softer, more distant, harder to reach. And without that voice, everything felt unstable. I didn't feel empowered. I felt disoriented. The scariest part wasn't the possibility of losing my marriage. It was the realization that I was losing myself inside the noise, and I had no idea how to find my way back. Chapter 8. The first time I truly heard myself. I didn't decide to stop talking. I just couldn't do it anymore. There was no dramatic moment, No powerful declaration, just exhaustion. The kind that settles into your bones after you've explained yourself too many times and still feel misunderstood, especially by yourself. One morning, I opened my phone to text a friend about something that had happened the night before. My fingers hovered over the screen, already forming the narrative, and then I froze. I didn't know what to say, not because nothing had happened, but because I didn't know how I felt about it yet. And for the first time, I didn't want someone else to tell me. So I closed the app. That small pause felt terrifying. Silence had never been my strength. I had used words as lifelines, as proof that I was processing, healing, doing the work. But without constant feedback, I felt exposed, alone with thoughts I had been avoiding. The quiet was uncomfortable at first. Without outside opinions, emotions came up raw and unfiltered, contradictory, messy. One moment I felt grief, the next, relief, sometimes both at the same time. And no one was there to label them for me. I started noticing things I had ignored, the way my body reacted before my mind did, the tension in my shoulders during certain conversations, the ease I felt in others, the moments I softened without trying. I wasn't trying to decide anything yet. I was trying to listen. I stopped narrating my days, stopped rehearsing explanations, stopped imagining how my feelings would sound out loud. Instead, I let them exist quietly, without needing to be justified. It felt irresponsible at first, like I was withholding information, like I was being dishonest. But slowly, something shifted. The noise in my head lowered, not completely, but enough for something familiar to emerge. My own voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't speak in absolutes. It didn't rush me toward conclusions. It asked questions instead of giving answers. What do you actually need right now? What feels heavy? What feels safe? I hadn't asked myself those things in a long time. For the first time in months, my thoughts weren't crowded with other people's endings. There was space again. Space to feel, without immediately interpreting. Space to be uncertain without panicking. I realized how rarely I had been alone with myself, not physically, but emotionally. And in that quiet, I understood something important. Clarity doesn't come from more voices. It comes from fewer. That didn't mean I suddenly knew what to do about my marriage. I didn't. But I knew something just as important. I needed to protect this silence, because for the first time in a long while, it felt like truth was finally allowed to speak. Once I created silence, patterns became impossible to ignore. Not in others, but in what I had absorbed. With distance, I could finally look back at the advice I had received without being inside it. And that's when I saw it clearly. None of it was neutral, not even the well-intentioned kind. Every opinion came from a life, from choices made or avoided, from wounds that had either healed or hardened. I started replaying conversations with new awareness. The friend who insisted that men don't change wasn't describing men. She was protecting herself from disappointment. If change wasn't possible, she didn't have to grieve what she never got. The one who framed independence as the only respectable choice wasn't celebrating freedom. She was justifying her own loneliness, turning solitude into superiority so it wouldn't hurt as much. My mother's insistence on endurance wasn't wisdom. It was survival. She had learned to call sacrifice love because admitting otherwise would mean questioning an entire lifetime. And my Aunt Linda, her advice about staying for the children, suddenly sounded less like strength and more like unresolved regret, as if she needed my marriage to last longer than hers, so her own endings wouldn't feel like failures. None of them were bad people, but all of them were speaking from themselves. I finally understood something I hadn't been ready to accept before. When people give advice, they rarely offer solutions. They offer reflections, their boundaries, their fears, their unhealed stories. And when you're vulnerable, you don't just hear advice, you absorb it. I had treated every opinion as equally valid, without asking the most important question. Valid for whom? I had handed my discernment to people who weren't living my consequences. People who wouldn't sit with the outcome of my choices. People who could afford certainty because they weren't risking anything. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me sober. I saw how easily I had mistaken confidence for clarity, volume for truth, experience for authority, even when that experience was unresolved. I had been outsourcing my intuition to voices that felt stronger than mine, and the cost of that was steep. I had doubted my perceptions, minimized my emotional intelligence, distrusted my capacity to hold complexity, all because I believed that someone else must know better. But silence taught me otherwise. It taught me that advice isn't dangerous because it's wrong. It's dangerous because it's persuasive, especially when it speaks to parts of you that are already hurting. That's when I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't let anyone else interpret my life for me anymore. Not because they were malicious, but because they were human, and so was I. And for the first time, that felt like enough. With the noise gone, I could finally separate things. Not cleanly, not perfectly, but honestly. For months, I had been asking the wrong question. Is my marriage failing? What I needed to ask was simpler and harder. What exactly is in crisis? Because not everything that hurts is broken. I started listing truths instead of conclusions. We struggled to communicate without getting defensive. We avoided certain conversations because we didn't know how to have them safely. We were tired, emotionally, mentally, relationally. Those things were real, but they weren't the same as indifference. They weren't contempt. They weren't cruelty. They weren't the absence of care. I saw how easily frustration had been interpreted as incompatibility, how exhaustion had been labeled as failure, how a difficult season had been mistaken for a final diagnosis. That distinction mattered more than I had realized. I also saw my part, clearly, and without shame. I had stopped inviting dialogue. I had assumed I already knew what he would say. I had carried silent expectations and resented him for not meeting them. I had shared my doubts everywhere except where they belonged. That wasn't self-protection. It was avoidance, and avoidance had costs. At the same time, I didn't minimize his limits. There were patterns he struggled to see, emotional skills he hadn't developed yet, places where he shut down instead of leaning in. Both things could be true. The crisis wasn't about love disappearing. It was about connection weakening. And connection doesn't usually collapse from one side alone. That realization brought an unexpected sense of dignity. I wasn't a victim trapped in a failing marriage. I wasn't a coward staying out of fear. I wasn't a hero for considering leaving. I was a human being inside a complicated relationship, navigating pain without the tools I needed. Once I saw that, the pressure to decide immediately eased. I didn't have to rush toward an ending to prove something. I didn't have to stay to justify my endurance. The question shifted. Not should I leave or stay, but what needs to change, for me and between us, for either choice to be healthy. That question didn't have an instant answer, but for the first time, it felt like the right one, and that changed everything. Once I stopped asking everyone else what I should do, the decision became heavier, and strangely lighter at the same time. Heavier because there was no one left to hide behind. No borrowed certainty, no ready-made answers. If I stayed, it would be because I chose to. If I left, it would be because I owned it. Lighter because, for the first time, the choice belonged to me. I realized how often I had framed the situation in extremes. Staying meant settling. Leaving meant self-respect. Those were the narratives I had inherited. But real life isn't that clean. Staying can be an act of courage. Leaving can be an act of clarity. And sometimes, neither is possible until something deeper shifts. What I wanted wasn't an outcome. It was autonomy. I didn't want to make a decision to satisfy an audience or silence critics. I wanted to make one that I could live with, quietly, privately, without needing to defend it. That meant stepping out of reaction mode. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" I asked, "What do I need to feel grounded again?" The answer surprised me. I needed boundaries. Not ultimatums. Not dramatic declarations. Boundaries around my emotional space, around what I shared, around who had access to my uncertainty. I stopped discussing my marriage with people who had already made up their minds. I stopped updating those who treated my life like a storyline. I chose a much smaller circle, people who could listen without steering. And most importantly, I began having conversations at home that I had been avoiding. Not confrontational ones, honest ones. I spoke without rehearsed language, without borrowed phrases, without explaining myself as if someone else were listening. I allowed pauses. I allowed discomfort. I allowed him to be imperfect. And myself, too. Those conversations didn't magically fix everything, but they were real. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't performing strength or victimhood. I was present, and that presence gave me back something essential: choice. I understood then that my power didn't come from staying or leaving. It came from no longer letting fear, or other people's opinions, decide for me. Whatever happened next, it would be mine, and that was something I hadn't felt in a very long time. There's a kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with dramatic scenes or clear goodbyes. It comes quietly, disguised as emptiness, as the strange disorientation of realizing that something familiar is no longer holding you the way it used to. No one warned me about that part. When I stopped explaining my marriage to others, when I pulled it back into privacy, something unexpected happened. I felt loss, regardless of what the outcome would be. I grieved the version of us that existed before the noise. I grieved the certainty I once had. I grieved the role I had played for so long without questioning it. And this time, there was no audience. No one checking in, no one offering opinions, no one telling me how strong I was being. The silence that once scared me now revealed the truth of what I was losing. I missed the routine more than I expected, the shared coffee in the morning, the unspoken understanding of how our days worked, the comfort of knowing where I belonged, even when things were hard. Losing that ground felt destabilizing. Even the smallest support, once gone, leaves a noticeable absence, and I had underestimated how much those small, ordinary moments mattered to me, not because they were perfect, but because they were familiar. This grief didn't ask to be fixed, it asked to be felt, and for the first time, I let it exist without rushing to label it as a sign. It didn't automatically mean I should stay. It didn't automatically mean I should leave. It simply meant something meaningful was changing. I learned that grief isn't always about losing a person. Sometimes it's about losing a version of yourself. The woman who believed endurance was love. The woman who measured her worth by how much she could tolerate. The woman who needed external approval to trust her own decisions. Letting her go hurt, but it also created space. In that quiet grief, I wasn't being watched. I wasn't being advised. I wasn't being pushed toward an answer. I was just human. And strangely, that made the pain feel cleaner, more honest, less confusing. For the first time, the sorrow belonged only to me, and that made it easier to carry. Once the grief softened, something else emerged. Not relief, not excitement, curiosity. Without constant feedback from others, I had space to notice myself again. Not who I was supposed to be, not who I had been trying to prove myself as, just who I was, quietly, when no one was watching. It felt unfamiliar at first. I realized how much of my identity had been shaped in reaction to expectations, to advice, to roles I never consciously chose. Wife, strong woman, the one who holds things together. Without those labels constantly being reinforced, I felt oddly undefined, and that scared me. But it also felt honest. I began doing small things without explaining them to anyone, changing routines, spending time alone without narrating it, letting my days unfold without turning them into stories. There was a strange freedom in that. I started noticing what gave me energy and what drained it, which conversations left me feeling grounded, which ones left me anxious or defensive. I paid attention to my body in ways I hadn't before, how tension showed up, how ease felt. I wasn't trying to rebuild my life yet. I was reacquainting myself with it. I learned that I didn't need constant intensity to feel alive, that peace didn't mean resignation, that stability could feel warm instead of dull, if it came with honesty. Slowly, I trusted my perception again. I didn't need consensus to validate my feelings. I didn't need dramatic clarity to move forward. I allowed myself to be undecided without seeing it as weakness. And in that undecided space, my self-respect grew, not from grand gestures, but from quiet consistency, from choosing not to overshare, from protecting my inner process, from letting myself change my mind without shame. I stopped needing to be understood by everyone. I started needing to be understood by myself, and that shift changed how I showed up in every area of my life. I felt more present, less reactive, more grounded in my own values instead of borrowed ones. For the first time, my life felt like it had edges again, and within those edges, I could finally breathe. Looking back, I don't regret seeking support. What I regret is not knowing what needed protection. I thought openness was strength. I thought transparency meant honesty. I didn't understand that some things aren't meant to be shared widely, not because they're shameful, but because they're fragile. If I had known then what I know now, I would have protected the unfinished parts, the conversations that were still forming, the doubts that hadn't yet settled, the emotions that needed time instead of interpretation. I would have protected our conflicts from becoming entertainment, from being simplified into good versus bad, from being handed over to people who only saw snapshots, never the full picture. I would have protected my husband's humanity, not because he was perfect, but because intimacy requires respect to survive. Ridicule, even subtle, erodes trust, and trust, once weakened, is hard to restore. I would have protected my own intuition. I silenced it too often in favor of louder voices. I let certainty replace curiosity. I allowed other people's endings to rush my process. Most of all, I would have protected the space between us, that invisible space where repair happens, where misunderstandings are worked through, where growth takes time and doesn't need witnesses. I know now that not every struggle is a crisis, not every doubt is a decision, and not every pain needs a crowd. Plans need protection. Vulnerability needs boundaries. Love, when it exists, needs privacy. I didn't know that then. I thought exposure would save me. I didn't understand that some things are healed not by being spoken about, but by being held carefully. And that lesson, learned the hard way, changed the way I love, the way I choose, and the way I protect what matters, forever. Today my life is quieter, not empty, quieter. The kind of quiet that no longer scares me because it isn't filled with other people's expectations. It's filled with presence, with responsibility, with truth that doesn't need applause to feel real. I don't share my inner world the way I used to, not because I'm closed, but because I'm careful. I've learned that access is not the same as intimacy, and that not everyone who listens is able to hold what they hear. I still value support. I still believe in connection. But now, I choose it intentionally. I notice how different it feels to make decisions without an audience, how grounding it is to sit with uncertainty without rushing to justify it, how powerful it is to trust myself even when the answer isn't clear yet. My marriage, whatever form it takes, belongs to the people living inside it. My healing belongs to me. My choices no longer need consensus. I've stopped confusing volume with wisdom, stopped mistaking confidence for truth, stopped believing that suffering becomes noble just because it's witnessed. What I know now is simple, but it took me a long time to learn. Not everyone who gives advice wants your peace. Some just want your choices to make sense of their own, and I don't carry that anymore. Today, when I feel doubt, I don't immediately reach for a phone. When I feel pain, I don't rush to explain it. When I feel clarity, I let it grow quietly before I share it. If I share it at all, I listen inward first, because the most important voice in my life was never missing. It was just buried under too many others. And now that I've learned how to hear it again, I protect it fiercely. That's where my strength lives now. Not in endurance, not in approval, not in being understood by everyone, but in knowing, deeply, calmly, and without needing permission, that my life is mine to live, and this time, no one else gets to narrate it.